At 15,000 feet, CEO Vanessa Harrington fired her pilot because he refused to fly through a wind shear zone. She stood in front of her board of directors, called the quiet single father a uniformed chauffeur, and handed the cockpit to the man who knew how to agree with her. 6 minutes later, the rear jump door blew open and Vanessa fell out of the aircraft wearing a parachute that could not open. No one moved. Reed Lawson pulled on the last rescue rig on board and jumped into open sky, the same man she had fired. Before Reed reaches her, make sure you never miss another story like this one. Hit subscribe and stay with us. The morning began the way most disasters do, quietly under clear skies, with everyone convinced the day would go exactly as planned. Harrington Field sat at the edge of the Mojave, a private strip of asphalt that smelled of jet fuel and ambition, and at 5:45 in the morning it was already alive, with camera crews, security detail, and logistics staff preparing for the largest single-product demonstration in Harrington Aerospace's 30-year history. The company's Guardian 1 parachute system was set to debut before a live audience of defense contractors, government officials, and financial analysts, all of whom had flown in specifically to watch Vanessa Harrington jump from 15,000 feet and land, with the controlled elegance of a woman who built the technology beneath her boots. The contract riding on the afternoon was worth $4.2 billion, and every person on that tarmac knew it. Reed Lawson arrived 3 hours before any of them. He walked the Harrington Falcon H-72 in the gray pre-dawn light, running his hands along the fuselage the way a surgeon checks a patient before cutting, looking not for what was visible but for what shouldn't be there. He had been flying for Harrington Aerospace for 2 years, hired personally by Vanessa's father before the old man's health forced him to step back, and in those 2 years Reed had never once requested a meeting, never complained about scheduling, never asked for a raise. He was the sort of man who communicated through action. The flight logs he kept immaculate, the pre-flight checklists he completed without shortcuts, the quiet adjustments he made before anyone thought to ask. On this particular morning, within 20 minutes of beginning his inspection, he found 4 things that made the small muscles along his jaw go tight. The seal on the Guardian 1 rig assigned to Vanessa had been replaced with one whose threading was slightly off. Factory seals sat flush. This one showed a hairline gap on the lower left. The automatic activation device, mounted above the reserve, had a fresh scratch on its housing, the kind made by a tool, not by routine contact. The Weather Service had pushed a shear layer alert for the corridor between Bishop and Tonopah, exactly the route the demonstration required. And the technical sign-off sheet in the aircraft's maintenance binder carried Brooke Ellison's signature, but the letter form on the capital B was different from every previous report Reed had on file. He requested a meeting with Vanessa at 6:15. She was in the main hangar with her investors, standing at the center of a ring of handshakes and camera flashes, wearing a flight suit the color of gunmetal that had clearly been chosen by a stylist rather than a quartermaster. Graham Voss intercepted Reed before he reached her. Graham was 52, silver-templed, and spoke in the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades learning exactly how much warmth to deploy in any given situation. He was polished in the way that expensive furniture is polished, smooth on the surface and hollow when you knocked on it. He listened to Reed's concerns with his chin slightly raised and his hands folded in front of him, then said, with the patience of a man correcting a child's arithmetic, that military pilots were famously uncomfortable with automated systems, that Guardian 1 had logged over 1,200 successful test drops, and that bringing doubt into this hangar on this morning would be the kind of professional error from which a career rarely recovered. Reed stood his ground. He asked to pull the rig and inspect it on a table before the flight. Graham smiled and said he would pass the concern along. Vanessa heard the exchange. She excused herself from the investor circle and crossed the hangar floor with the particular stride of someone who had learned that speed communicated authority, and she stopped in front of Reed with her arms at her sides, the way executives stand when they want their posture to say what they won't say directly. She told him, in a voice pleasant enough to be captured by the nearby microphones and still carry its full weight, that he was hired to deliver her to the correct position in the sky, not to make product assessments. Graham added, with a lightness that was sharper for it, that a man worried about a few air currents might do better to focus on keeping his uniform pressed than to offer opinions about contracts worth more than his lifetime earnings combined. The other directors shifted slightly, some looking down, none of them objecting. Reed did not raise his voice. He asked once more for permission to inspect the parachute on a table in the equipment bay. Vanessa told him the flight would depart on schedule and that she had full confidence in her engineering team. She turned back toward her investors before he finished nodding. He was walking toward the aircraft when he stopped and turned back once more, and in doing so, he caught something that the morning's noise and motion had almost buried. Graham Voss was standing just inside the hangar door, and he was handing something to Trent Maddox, small, flat, dark, the size of a keycard. Trent pocketed it without looking down, which meant he already knew what it was. The gesture lasted less than 2 seconds, and then Graham was greeting someone else, and Trent was walking toward the aircraft, and the morning carried on as though nothing had passed between them. Reed filed it away in the part of his mind trained to hold things quietly until they became necessary. The Falcon H-72 lifted off at 8:43 and banked east toward the Nevada line with the easy grace of an aircraft designed to impress. The cabin had been configured for the occasion. Forward of the jump door sat a VIP section arranged with leather seats and a small presentation screen, where Vanessa stood as the plane climbed and delivered a 30-minute address on Guardian 1 that was part product pitch and part personal mythology. She spoke about the system with the fluency of someone who had memorized the engineering specs without having written them, describing the automatic altitude detection, the adaptive steering canopy, the triple redundant reserve trigger, and the biometric wristband that allowed a jumper to monitor every variable from exit to touchdown. She told the board members that the days of parachute expertise being required for a successful deployment were ending, that Guardian 1 made the act of falling from a plane something a trained civilian could accomplish safely, and that she would prove it before lunch. Reed listened through his headset and said nothing, watching the Stikini weather overlay update in the corner of the navigation display with the steady patience of someone waiting for the room to catch up to what he already understood. Trent was in the right seat. He and Reed had worked together for 16 months, and in those 16 months, Reed had arrived at a clear-eyed appraisal of the younger pilot. Technically competent, emotionally brittle, and constitutionally unable to tolerate the knowledge that someone else in a room was better at something he wanted to be best at. Trent knew Reed had more hours, more certifications, and more actual flying experience than he would accumulate in 2 more careers, and he had responded to this knowledge the way some people respond to any truth they can't outrun, by deciding that the right people hadn't been informed yet. Twice on the climb out, Trent suggested cutting west to shorten the transit time to the drop zone. Twice, Reed redirected to the longer route that kept them clear of the shear corridor. On the second redirect, Graham's voice came through the cabin intercom, smooth as laminated wood. It appeared, he said with the mildness of a man making an observation about the weather, that their captain was perhaps less comfortable with a little turbulence than his record suggested. A few soft laughs moved through the VIP section. Vanessa tilted her head and asked Reed, loudly enough that it was clearly not a private question, whether he felt confident in his ability to execute the mission. Reed answered without turning from the navigation panel. He said that confidence and recklessness were not the same thing, that the data on the shear layer was current and specific, and that he was formally recommending the jump be either moved to a lower altitude or postponed pending improved conditions. Vanessa appeared at the cockpit entrance, one hand on the doorframe, and she looked at the old Seiko on Reed's wrist. The one his daughter had given him when she was 12, the crystal cracked and resealed twice. And she said, in a tone designed to land between private and public, that a man who couldn't afford a new watch shouldn't presume to lecture someone running a company worth $11 billion on how to protect it. Reed let the moment exist without filling it. Then he asked, quietly, a single question. If he could demonstrate that the parachute had been compromised, would she cancel the jump? Vanessa looked at him for a long moment and did not answer. The indicator light on the instrument panel, the one tied to the rear jump door, blinked once and held, showing a status that should not have been possible at altitude. The aircraft reached 15,000 feet and leveled. Vanessa moved to the rear cabin, and the crew began equalizing pressure for the jump sequence. The air in the cabin thinning slightly as the door seals adjusted and the ambient noise shifted into the lower register. That meant a separation point was approaching. Reed requested Trent hold course and altitude while he crossed back to check the door lock status signal, which had continued pulsing irregularly. Before he could leave the seat, Trent keyed a sequence into the secondary display with the particular deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed it. 3 presses, a hold, a confirmation, and the warning light cleared. Reed watched it happen and recognized what it meant in the way a person recognizes a word they've never seen before but can read perfectly well. Trent was not troubleshooting the signal. He was removing it. In the rear cabin, Vanessa was in front of a mounted camera, the Guardian 1 rig on her back, speaking in the bright, confident register of someone who had been rehearsing for this specific moment for months. She described the wristband display, invited the board to watch the real-time telemetry on the cabin screen, and announced that in approximately 4 minutes she would step out the door and demonstrate the safest skydive in aviation history. Reed brought the aircraft left, hard and purposeful, rotating away from the drop zone heading and announcing over the intercom that the jump was suspended pending weather evaluation. The cabin tilted. The investors reached for armrests. The camera operator caught himself against a seat back. Vanessa grabbed the doorframe and went still for 2 seconds before the expression on her face reorganized itself from shock into something that people who have spent their lives in charge do instinctively when they are publicly surprised. She turned it into anger. She was in the cockpit doorway in 15 seconds, and her voice was controlled in the way that very hot things are sometimes very still. She told Reed to return to the jump heading immediately. Reed said, without looking away from the instruments, that the regulations governing air operations granted a captain final authority over any decision that affected the safety of the aircraft and those aboard it, that he was exercising that authority, and that when they landed she was welcome to fire him, report him, or do both simultaneously. She said, "You are confusing yourself with someone who has power. You are a driver with wings," Reed said. "On the ground you are the CEO. Up here I am responsible for the lives in this aircraft, including yours." He meant it without drama. That was perhaps what made it worse. She stood in the doorway for 3 seconds longer, then turned toward the cabin, and in front of her board of directors and her camera crew, and the investors who had flown in to watch her triumph, announced that Reed Lawson was terminated, effective immediately, and that Trent Maddox would assume command for the remainder of the flight. Reed sat very still for a moment. He issued one final warning. She could fire him after they landed, but she could not fire the weather, the altitude, or a piece of equipment that had been deliberately compromised. She told him to vacate the cockpit. He removed his headset, palmed the emergency communications unit clipped beneath the instrument housing and walked into the cabin. He did not slam a door or raise his voice. As he passed Vanessa, he glanced at the Guardian 1 rig on her back, specifically at the activation seal above the left shoulder blade, and the seal had changed color. Not dramatically, a shift in shade, the kind produced by chemical contact with a reactive agent. The automatic activation device was no longer operational. Reed moved toward Vanessa and tried to tell her. Graham Voss stepped forward, and two members of the security team positioned themselves between Reed and the CEO, politely and with the practiced ease of people who had done this before. Graham said, with regret so smooth it might have been genuine, that Mr. Lawson had already caused enough disruption and that perhaps a seat near the rear would be appropriate for the remainder of the flight. At the front of the cabin, Trent banked the aircraft back toward the original heading, not because he had assessed the shear data and disagreed with Reed, but because he had been told to, and because he believed the stability systems would handle whatever the atmosphere produced. He wanted to prove he could do what Reed would not, and he wanted the audience for it. The rear jump door was unsealed from the control panel and began to open with the low hydraulic moan that preceded the rush. Wind came in fast and loud, the way it always does at altitude, not a breeze but a presence, a wall of moving air that reorganized everything in the cabin around its own priorities. Vanessa stood near the door in the posture of a woman performing authority she was not feeling anymore, her hand on the grab rail, her eyes on the camera, waiting for Graham's signal to proceed. The wristband display showed a row of green indicators. Reed, from his position near the rear bulkhead, could see what the display couldn't. The activation lanyard on the main canopy was seated incorrectly, rotated a quarter turn from its housing in a way that would prevent clean deployment. He shouted her to step back from the door. The wind took the words. Graham brought his hand down in a gesture meant for the camera operator. Trent activated the keycard sequence. A control input was written into the flight management computer from outside the cockpit standard interface, a modification buried inside a test program that had no business being on an active aircraft, and the Falcon tilted sharply left, a sudden 15-degree bank that produced exactly the kind of vector force a standing person near an open door cannot resist. The safety tether Vanessa should have been clipped to had been disconnected from its floor anchor, the locking mechanism removed with the same quiet precision as everything else. She went through the door, not dramatically, not in slow motion the way it happens in films. She was there and then she was not. And for half a second the cabin was completely silent in the way that only genuine catastrophe can produce. Graham's face arranged itself into horror. His hands went to his temples. He announced that there was nothing to be done, that turning back would accomplish nothing, that they should continue to the airfield and contact emergency services from the ground. Reed looked at the altimeter on the nearest panel. Vanessa had been falling for approximately 15 seconds. At terminal velocity, she had less than 60 seconds before the altitude margin for parachute deployment became critical. He crossed the cabin in 4 strides. He pulled the dual-load rescue rig from the emergency housing on the bulkhead, clipped the communications unit to the front harness point, and moved to the open door. One of the board members, a thin man in his 60s who had said very little the entire flight, asked Reed what he intended to do. Reed said his employment might have ended, but his responsibility had not. Graham told him he had no right to use company equipment, that he was no longer a Harrington employee, that any action he took would be treated as further evidence of misconduct. Reed looked at him for exactly as long as it took to understand that Graham needed him either on the aircraft or on the ground silently, that a live Reed with a live Vanessa was the only outcome that threatened the story Graham had already started building. Then Reed stepped out of the aircraft at 14,900 feet and fell into the Nevada sky. Graham turned to Trent and told him to take the aircraft to the airfield. He did not say to circle. He did not say to look. Trent complied, because Trent still believed the plan he'd been told about, and the plan he'd been told about did not include a murder. Reed pulled his body into a vertical blade position to build speed, because catching a person in freefall is not a matter of jumping toward them but of outfalling them, of using mass and position to collapse the distance before it becomes permanent. He could see Vanessa below him, a small dark shape against the tan geometry of the desert floor, her body in the loose, chaotic tumble of someone who has not trained for this and is operating entirely on terror. She had tried the main deployment handle twice. He could see the slack in the lanyard, and the reserve trigger on her wristband was showing the red cross that meant the activation circuit had been interrupted. She was not going to save herself. There was no mechanism left for her to engage. At 10,000 feet he reached her wrist. The airstream between two bodies in freefall is not cooperative. It pools and eddies and shoves with the mindlessness of physics, and the first contact threw them apart before Reed could get a grip. He saw her face in that half-second, and what he saw there was not the expression of a CEO, not the composed authority she carried at ground level like a second skin. It was just fear, the undecorated kind, the kind that looks the same on everyone. He came in again from below and to the left, absorbed the deflection, wrapped his left arm through the chest clip of her rig and held. She instinctively grabbed his forearm and he felt her trying to help, adjusting her body toward his, which was exactly right, and he was grateful for it. He worked the rescue hook with his right hand, attaching her harness at the central connection point to the dual-load ring on his chest rig, a system designed for exactly this, built to withstand the opening shock of a reserve canopy loaded with two people. He found the main obstruction immediately, a small metal pin, machined to fit, inserted through the deployment housing in a way that would pass a visual inspection at distance, but would prevent the canopy from releasing cleanly. He pulled the safety blade from his leg pocket and cut the housing clear. One attachment point on the connection hook was binding. He had to rotate it twice before the locking gate seated properly, and those rotations cost him altitude he didn't have to spend. At 4,000 feet, he deployed the reserve. The canopy opened with a shock that compressed his spine and drove the harness into his shoulders like something trying to separate him from himself, and then they were swinging in the enormous quiet that exists under a deployed chute, the desert rising toward them with unhurried certainty. The winds at low altitude had pushed them well east of the planned landing zone, away from roads and structures and anything with a signal tower, deep into a stretch of flatland framed on three sides by low ridgelines. They cleared a rock formation by perhaps 30 feet, and then the ground came up, and Reed angled himself to absorb the contact, hitting on his side and taking the full impact through his left shoulder while keeping Vanessa's legs clear of the impact zone. They came to a stop in a cloud of alkali dust. Neither of them moved for several seconds. Then Vanessa turned her head and looked up at the sky where the aircraft had been, and there was nothing there. No circling. No signal lights, nothing at all. Reed unclipped her harness and helped her to a sitting position, and then he pulled the damaged Guardian 1 rig free and held it up and showed her the pin. It was small and precise and entirely deliberate, and on its flat face, pressed into the metal with what had once required a stamp and a specific set of authorization codes, was a mark Reed recognized. The departmental identifier used by Harrington Aerospace's Internal Security Division, the division that reported directly to Graham Voss. They had no radio contact. The emergency unit had signal, but the ridgeline to the north was blocking the satellite path, and every attempt to raise a response produced static. Vanessa looked at the device in Reed's hand, and then at the landscape around them, and then at Reed himself. And what moved across her face was something more complicated than embarrassment. It was the particular reckoning of a person encountering a version of events in which they are not the protagonist. She asked him how he had known how to do that, the catch, the hook-in, the deployment. He told her without elaboration. 12 years of special operations aviation, over 200 military jumps, a 2-year certification as a rescue parachutist, and then an early separation from service when his daughter was 7 and his wife was dying, and someone needed to be home to make breakfast. He told her that her father had read his full service record before offering him the position, that the old man had said specifically that he wanted someone who would prioritize a passenger's life over a passenger's comfort. He told her that in 2 years of flying for her, he had filed 4 written safety concerns, none of which had been acknowledged. Vanessa said she had never read his personnel file. She had read Graham's summary of it. Reed said nothing for a moment, then told her that she understood the value of an aircraft without ever having bothered to understand the person responsible for it. He said it without heat. That was the quality she kept encountering in him. He delivered truths the way weather delivers itself, as observable fact rather than grievance. She began to apologize, and he stopped her, not unkindly, saying that words in the desert meant very little, and that there would be time for apologies after the facts were public and the right people were being held to account. He used the parachute fabric to construct a shade structure between 2 scrub formations and divided the small emergency water pack into thirds. They waited. 40 minutes after they landed, a helicopter appeared over the eastern ridgeline. It was fast and low and deliberately angled, and when it came close enough for the markings to resolve, Reed identified the dark gold insignia of Harrington Aerospace's private security unit. Not a rescue service, not a civilian contractor, not any agency with a reporting obligation. He understood immediately what its presence meant and what its absence of official affiliation allowed. He took the memory card from the camera unit, clipped to his rig, and pressed it into the recessed back pocket of Vanessa's flight suit, behind the zippered flap inside the secondary liner. She felt him do it, and he met her eyes, and she understood without being told that there was something on it Graham would not want delivered intact. The security team landed 20 meters out and approached with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed on the conclusion before the operation began. The team leader informed Reed that he was being detained pending investigation into unauthorized interference with a flight operation and the removal of an executive from a secured aircraft. Reed put his hands up. He stood between them and Vanessa, and he did not resist, because resistance would have given them a different kind of footage and a different kind of story, and he understood that the story being written right now was the one that would matter. Vanessa attempted to speak. The team leader said, with genuine professional regret, that medical guidance suggested the CEO had likely experienced acute psychological stress, and that her account would be formally documented once she had been evaluated and stabilized. They were both transported to a regional medical center. Reed was placed in a separate wing with a security presence at the door, and within the hour Graham Voss was standing before a cluster of microphones in the hospital parking lot, his face arranged in the expression of a man carrying a weight he had never expected to bear. He described, in the measured language of sorrow, how Reed Lawson had grown volatile after being relieved of command, how he had interfered with the parachute check, how in a confrontation near the jump door Vanessa had fallen, and Reed had followed in what Graham called, carefully, a deeply ambiguous sequence of events. He said that the company was cooperating fully with aviation authorities, that its thoughts were with Vanessa, and that it would not be appropriate to speculate further at this time. By the time he finished speaking, 3 outlets had already run the framing that Reed was a suspect in the disappearance of the CEO. In her hospital room, Vanessa was already moving. She asked a nurse for a tablet. She opened the document server under her own credentials and requested the executive calendar for the prior 48 hours. Graham had filed a provisional CEO succession instrument at 9:14 in the morning. 11 minutes after she fell from the aircraft. A person who believed his CEO was alive and rescuable does not file succession paperwork in 11 minutes. She found the memory card in the liner of her flight suit, requested a private device from the hospital administrator, and played what was on it. Reed's voice, offering warnings, her own voice dismissing them, Graham's face signaling the camera crew to continue. The open door, the tilt, the empty space where she had been standing, and the pin held up to the light by Reed's hand at the moment they landed, before anyone could have placed it there after the fact. Graham came to her room that evening. He sat beside the bed with the easy familiarity of someone who had advised the Harrington family for 20 years, and told her that the board was frightened, that the stock would open down sharply, that the company needed a steady hand during the transition, and that she should consider the documentation he had prepared. He placed a tablet in her hands. She looked at the transfer of operational authority, and she looked at him, and she said she would like to read it carefully before signing anything. Graham relaxed slightly. While he watched the news on the wall screen, she forwarded a complete copy of everything on the memory card to Brooke Ellison's personal account with a forward message: "Verify the rig records." Brooke received the files at 11:47 at night and spent the following 4 hours doing what she did with the precision that had made her indispensable and the moral clarity that had made her miserable for 6 months. She had signed off on the Guardian 1 system's airworthiness, and she had done so because the paperwork she was shown reflected a rig that had passed inspection. But her signature on the document Reed had found was not her signature, and once Brooke confirmed that, everything else was a matter of technical documentation. The unit had been checked out of the safety equipment bay at 6:20 on the morning of the flight and returned at 8:15, a window of 1 hour and 55 minutes during which it had been in an area Reed had never accessed because it required a security clearance belonging to Graham Voss. The rig that had boarded the aircraft was not the rig that had been inspected. The paperwork had been altered by someone with administrative access to Brooke's credential set, which she had reported compromised 2 months earlier and which Graham had assured her was a false alarm. Graham returned to Vanessa's room the following morning, expecting a signature, and found instead that she was dressed and had called a board meeting. He told her she was in no condition for this. She told him the condition she was in was excellent. She told him she had evidence of equipment sabotage, document forgery, fraudulent credential use, and willful abandonment of 2 people in a desert, and that the meeting would include Reed Lawson as a witness. Graham said that a contracted pilot had no standing to address a board of directors. Vanessa said, "That man was present when every one of you abandoned me in the sky. He has more standing in that room than anyone currently seated in it." Graham's composure shifted by 1 degree, not enough for a casual observer to name, but enough for Vanessa, who had spent her career reading the small adjustments people make when they realize they've already lost. He played his last card in the boardroom itself. A technical access log appeared on the screen, showing that Reed's employee credentials had been used to access the Guardian 1 maintenance database at 6:47 on the morning of the flight, with modification entries consistent with the alterations made to the activation device. The log was clean, time-stamped, and carried Reed's digital signature. Graham presented it with the weary gravity of a man who had hoped he was wrong. He told the board that Reed had staged an elaborate rescue to position himself as a hero, to discredit the safety system that would eventually make his skills obsolete, and to force Vanessa into a position of gratitude that he could leverage. Reed looked at the log without touching it and asked the board one question. What time did the access occur? 6:47 was the answer. He then asked Brooke to display the airfield security footage from the exterior east maintenance bay, where he had been conducting an engine oil check at 6:47 and where 3 fixed cameras had recorded his unbroken presence for 45 minutes. An access entry from a building he was demonstrably outside of at the time it was entered meant someone had used a cloned copy of his credentials, and cloning employee credentials required an administrator card, of which 2 existed in the entire company. One belonged to Vanessa. The other had been issued to Graham Voss. Trent was brought in. He sat with his arms crossed and gave nothing until Reed asked him a single question without any freight attached to it. "Who gave you the card before we took off?" Trent looked at Graham. The look was its own answer. Reed explained, with the specificity of someone who had spent 12 hours reconstructing a sequence in his head, that the keycard Trent had activated was not a standard override but a test mode toggle buried inside a prototype control package, a package that, when activated, accepted a pre-programmed lateral instruction from an external source and executed it as a flight management input. Trent had pressed the sequence thinking he was suppressing an instrument warning. What he had actually done was execute a maneuver command designed to throw a person through an open door. He had not known what he was carrying. Reed said so, clearly and without embellishment, because the truth was already sufficient and the truth did not require anyone to be destroyed beyond their actual culpability. Trent, understanding that he was 2 sentences from being the only one in the room without a witness, described the conversation in which Graham had offered him the directorship of aviation operations in exchange for discrediting Reed prior to the flight. He had not known about the parachute. He had not known anyone was meant to die. The satellite backup server contained the original flight data record, unaltered, because Graham had instructed Trent to purge the onboard storage, but had not controlled the off-site mirror. The data showed the lateral input, the timing, the door status, and the 3 minutes during which no return heading was plotted after Vanessa's departure from the aircraft. One board member, the same thin man who had watched Reed leave the aircraft, quietly proposed a private settlement. He suggested the company could offer Reed a significant sum in exchange for a mutual non-disclosure. Reed said, "I did not fall 15,000 feet to sell what I found when I landed." Graham stood and moved toward the exit. The investigators from the Aviation Authority, who had been listening via Vanessa's open line for the preceding 40 minutes, were already in the corridor. Vanessa had patched the boardroom feed to the company's internal network, and when she announced it, the silence that followed was the kind produced by people who understand simultaneously that they are being watched and that they have already been seen. Every Harrington Aerospace employee with access to a screen was watching the room where their company's future was being decided, and they had watched it from the moment Vanessa played the memory card footage. Reed's warnings, her dismissal, Graham's signal, the empty door, the pin in the light. There was no narration needed. The footage said everything. Vanessa did not minimize her own role. She stood before the camera and the board and the thousands of people watching and said clearly that she had called a trained professional a uniformed chauffeur, that she had fired him in front of an audience to protect her pride, that she had ignored documented safety concerns because they inconvenienced a schedule, and that her arrogance had created precisely the vulnerability Graham had exploited. She said that the man who had jumped from the aircraft had done so not to become a hero, not to create leverage, not for any reason that could be explained by self-interest, but because he had decided that his job description included keeping people alive even when those people had just publicly fired him. She said, "Reed Lawson did not only save my life, he saved this company from the people I chose to trust over the person who kept telling me the truth." Graham was stopped at the corridor door and was escorted, with a quietness that matched the gravity of what he had done toward the waiting investigators. The board members who had laughed at Graham's joke about the pilot being uncomfortable with wind did not speak. The ones who had looked away when Vanessa humiliated Reed in the hangar did not speak. The one who had proposed the settlement looked at his hands. Vanessa turned to Reed and, in front of the employees and the board and the camera that was still running, apologized with the specificity that genuine apologies require. For the remark about his uniform, for the remark about his watch, for the dismissal, for the 16 months of concern reports she had never read, for building a leadership structure in which the people who agreed with her were rewarded, and the person who told her the truth was classified as a problem. Reed accepted it without performance. He said nothing that could have been printed as a quote, because he was not interested in quotes. He said it was a start. He said he would not return to the captain's seat under the previous arrangement. The board absorbed this in silence. He offered terms instead: a fully independent safety division with direct reporting authority to the aviation regulatory body, not to the executive suite. A standing provision granting any pilot the unilateral right to cancel any flight segment for safety reasons, without penalty or review, and a prohibition on the termination of any crew member for refusing a command they believed endangered the aircraft or its passengers. Vanessa accepted all three conditions before anyone else in the room could object. 6 months passed. Harrington Aerospace did not collapse. It restructured, the way organizations sometimes do when the people at the top are forced to reckon with what they had actually built versus what they believed they had built. Graham Voss faced federal charges covering equipment sabotage, criminal conspiracy, and falsification of aviation maintenance records. Trent Maddox cooperated with investigators and received a suspended license and a sentence that reflected his partial knowledge of the scheme. Brooke Ellison was formally cleared, reinstated, and promoted to lead the Safety Certification Division she had been quietly undermining her own reports to protect. The Guardian 1 program was suspended pending a complete independent review, which Reed oversaw in his new role as the company's autonomous director of flight safety, a position that answered to no one inside the executive structure and whose findings could not be suppressed by anyone holding a corporate title. He used the settlement funds for something that surprised no one who actually knew him: a training endowment for rescue parachute certification offered to pilots whose employers would not pay for it, and a support program for aviation families experiencing medical hardship. He did not announce it. It was listed in a regulatory filing, where Sadie found it while researching her father's company for a school assignment. She called him that evening and told him she was proud of him, and he told her the parachute had worked, which was what he had been trained to ensure, and that was the whole of it. Sadie, who had grown up watching her father decline every opportunity to explain himself, knew better than to push for more. Vanessa presented Reed with his old Seiko watch at a small internal ceremony that the company's communications team wanted to turn into a press event and that Reed declined to allow. She had taken it to a watchmaker and had the crystal replaced and the movement serviced, and on the back she had arranged for a single line to be engraved: "For the man who did not let go, even when I told him to." Reed read it twice, put it on, and thanked her in the manner of someone who registers the gesture fully and will think about it quietly for a long time. The ceremony lasted 14 minutes. The trust between them was not rebuilt in a speech or a handshake. It was rebuilt the way structural things are rebuilt, incrementally, through weight-bearing. Vanessa began attending the weekly safety briefings that had previously been delegated to an assistant. She began reading crew files herself. She stopped using corporate rank to settle technical disagreements. In the first board meeting after Graham's arrest, when a director suggested that the new safety protocols were perhaps overly conservative and might affect the company's agility, Vanessa said that agility was valuable and that people who fell from aircraft at 15,000 feet generally did not get to develop it further, and the discussion moved on. 3 months into Reed's new role, Vanessa asked if she could observe a flight systems evaluation from the jump seat. He considered it, then said yes. On the morning of the evaluation, she arrived at the aircraft before the crew, not because she was the CEO and could, but because she wanted to understand the pre-flight process from the beginning. She watched Reed work the exterior inspection with the same patience she had ignored on the morning that had nearly ended both of them. When he reached the parachute bay, she did not say anything. When the inspection was complete, she asked if there was anything she could do to help with the pre-departure checklist. He handed her a laminated sheet and told her where to start. The aircraft lifted from the runway as the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline and the desert floor fell away beneath them. Vanessa did not give any instructions. She did not schedule the morning, or optimize the ascent, or manage the outcome. She sat in the jump seat of the aircraft, belonging to the company her family had built across 3 generations, and she looked ahead at the sky she had once thought her money and her name could navigate for her, and she was simply present in it, trusting the man who sat in front of her to do what he had always been trained to do. Reed did not speak unless the flight required it. At altitude, he glanced at the Seiko on his wrist. The old glass, the old hands, and the dial caught the light and held it for a moment, the same way it had on the morning she had used it against him. He said nothing. He kept his eyes on the sky, and the aircraft flew on, steady and untroubled, 15,000 feet above the ground where everything had almost ended and everything had instead begun.
Damn. There we go. There we go. Holy shit. Oh shit. Oh wow. Oh wow.